Okay, I'm gonna discuss the research of Brian Hare and Vanessa Woods, and they have a new there's a new Netflix documentary about dogs, and they run a puppy clinic, or they train puppies at Duke University. I don't really know all the details, but Vanessa Woods was doing research work with Brian Hare, and she worked with bonobos because the bonobos did not like Brian Hare, and he was so the issue. I mean, to me, it was obvious. It was that they were reacting to his testosterone levels, because the bonobos, the females are in control, and they will beat up a male if they think the male is acting uppity, and so the males have less testosterone. And what Brian Hare points out is that what's fascinating is that the successful males of bonobos actually have more offspring, more babies than the successful chimpanzee males that are using violence to dominate the females. And so their research, then they came out with a book together because they ended up getting married, and their book was the what's the title again? I think it's called what's about friendliness, and they don't say they say it's not the same as friends, but they say that there's a evolutionary advantage to being friendly, and this goes across all organisms where you have a mutualistic advantage to being friendly. And so their argument is that this happened with the bonobos, where you had what they just call self-domestication. So like with dogs, the usual claim about dogs is that humans domesticated dogs, but they're arguing that that's not what happened. That actually it was the wolves were attracted to the waste of the humans, and then since the wolves kept nearby the humans, then the offspring had the genetic advantage of being more friendly. And that this was corroborated by the research on foxes in Russia, where they have a instinctual social cognition. And so what they call in evolution, they call it a spandrel, or that's one term for it, where you have this beneficial byproduct of the adaptation to friendliness that actually increases what they jokingly call dognition, which would be social cognition. And this was proven with the finger pointing experiment, where the domesticated foxes will follow the finger pointing, as a sign of social cognition. But apparently the bonobos will only do it, if they're really well trained with humans. But dogs will do it even as puppies. So it's become genetic and a genetic instinct in dogs to have social cognition. So then I came across a study on G to G, or what they call GG rubbing in bonobos, which is the females having mutual orgasms together. And they do this all the time as their social bonding, which is not, you don't find that in humans and chimpanzees, or at least not. I mean, it could be argued that it's found in some human cultures in a different way, which I'll get into. But there was a study where they found that this pointing ability is actually done by bonobos when they want the G to G rubbing, which shows that there's a direct connection between proto language in primates as a gestural communication, using pointing as social cognition, along with the G to G rubbing, the female orgasm. And so now there's a deeper level that I want to get into where like Vanessa Woods, she points out that, well, this is all based on the theory of mind, and she had a great conversation with their mentor, Michael Tomasello, and I think he works in Germany, maybe, but because Brian Hare was working with Michael in Germany doing research there, and so that's how Vanessa met Michael when she went to be with Brian in Germany or something. I don't know what all the details, but so Michael was like the mentor for both Vanessa and Brian, and so Michael was like he gave the research recommendations to Brian to go to Russia to study the foxes and to do the pointing experiment with the dogs. And so Vanessa, at first she was struggling with this idea because Michael was trying to point out, like, why is pointing significant? And so he had to explain, it's like, well, that's the basis of all human interaction, really, is the social cognition, is this theory of mind where you rely on what they call mirror neurons in neuroscience. So like, it's based on how others will perceive you in a social situation, obviously. And so, if somebody's like eccentric, then they're not going to be as much concerned about how others perceive them, or, maybe they're just doing their own thing or whatever. And then, then they might start to get singled out or fingered for being not fitting into the group for whatever reason. And so then I just found a recent PhD where the person argues that actually it's a wrong assumption of science to assume that conceptual thinking is dependent on the development of language as social cognition. And because there's many animals that demonstrate conceptual thinking conceptual skills without having language. And so eventually what often gets left out of these discussions is the meaning of music as social cognition, because there was a study recently about orangutans, and they found that orangutans, in their calls and their songs, their calling is actually recursive, which means that it has different levels of patterns in it, like subsets of structure. So basically they'll have if you think of it in terms of music, they'll have like a measure with different tempos within that same time period as a measure. So they'll break the same time period up into calls that are like a quarter note or a eighth note or a 16th note, which is basically you're doubling the time period for the call, for each measure in the same time period. So it's always been claimed that what makes human language different is that it has a self-recursive structure. But there's this new emphasis now on what they call musolanguage. And so that basically what happened is that at first language started out as gestures with like pointing and other kinds of gestures. But then as we developed tool use, we no longer had that hand for pointing. And so then the communication migrated to vocalization more than pointing. And of course, the music origin of language has been the focus of the radical anthropology research group in out of the UK, or based in the UK, but Camilla Power and Chris Knight and Jerome Lewis are the three main, and Ian Watts, and they have their radical anthropology lecture series on Vimeo, and then they repost it on their YouTube channel too, but I guess they're in summer break still. But so if you look at the origin of modern humans as being self-domesticated, which is the argument of Vanessa Woods and Brian Hare, their claim is that, well, we rely on friendliness even more than the bonobos, because we're relying on social cognition as the basis for our friendliness. So we rely on whatever cultural cues have social communication. So it could be a sports team or a flag or whatever. But if you look at what's truly universal to human culture, most people would say, well, it's eating. But actually what makes us human, I would say, is music. Is we have this ability, this urge to do synchronized body movements for dancing, and then every human culture has music as part of the culture. And if you look at there was been recent studies where they're showing that every human culture has the same reaction to music, where there's like happy music and scary, aggressive music, and then sad music. And so if we look at the older civilizations from farming they argued that there's a deeper meaning to music. There's a deeper cognitive value to it. And so in the yoga training as meditation, you're not relying on language for cognition. You're relying on the music directly. And if you study our original human culture, this is actually, this is explicit in the culture, what they call gum, num, and in the latest DNA science has shown that the so-called pygmies split off from the San Bushmen 225,000 years ago, which is a really long time ago. But yet they have the same focus of music as spiritual healing as this core of their culture, with dancing and singing. And this has been the focus of the radical anthropology research group. And so you have to start to wonder, well, why, I haven't scrutinized the work of Vanessa Woods and Hare to see if they actually cite the research of Chris Knight and Camilla Power. And I mean, you have basically two different, you have, social science, like the Hare and Vanessa Woods they're in primatology, I guess. So they're more trying to be like natural science versus social science. But I think they have published in psychology research also, because Michael Tomasello, I think he's technically a psychologist. So you have an overlap, and then there's also R. Brian Ferguson, who I've corresponded with a little bit. He's another anthropology professor, and he just had this big tome published on the history. What does he call it? War history and chimpanzees, something like that. But he's basically arguing that the supposed violent war culture of chimpanzees is actually a byproduct of humans being aggressive towards chimpanzees and moving in on chimpanzee territory. And you find, he had his earlier research was on the Yanomami in Venezuela, which was a similar claim, was that their supposed violent culture was actually a byproduct of Western colonialism, increasing the tensions for resources. And so when we look at this deeper meaning of cognition, of concepts without language, then we eventually might stumble onto the idea of what in yoga philosophy is called direct perception. Direct perception, or it's also called immediate awareness. It's more commonly known as like ESP or telepathy, or and then you have the whole concept of the paranormal in general as like telekinesis, and then so obviously at that point you've left science, supposedly, unless you study somebody like Olivier Costa de Beauregard, who was the mentor or the protege of Louis de Broglie, the Nobel physicist. So if you study Louis de Broglie's law of phase harmony, then Costa de Beauregard realized that this makes the paranormal to be the foundation of reality. And then you have Sir Roger Penrose making the same claim now as proto-consciousness being precognitive. And so that there's this inherent psychic awareness to information that's innate to the environment that humans live in. It's like a fifth dimension, but it's pure time and frequency And it's defined through the non-commutative mathematics, so science is blind to it inherently due to the wrong definition of mathematics. And so it preemptively cannot exist if they're using the wrong mathematical analysis. And so that redefines the theory of mind as a different type of mind that's defined more by music than it is by social cognition using gestures or talking or vocalization. But it's more based on listening as a logical inference process. And so I'll just leave it at that. And well, one of the problems that, like Vanessa Woods and Brian Hare, they point out that when you have humans being so friendly, you get the problem of a dialectical reversal as the opposite extreme, where then if somebody's not part of the in-group of friendliness, then they can become dehumanized, and so I'll get into that later.